Hi, I hope everyone is having a wonderful Wednesday. We will give it a few minutes for people just to log on and plan to get started by about 4:05. Okay, we do seem to have a number of people on already, so we might get into it. Before we start though, there's no general updates or announcements from the Biocurator working group team, but is there anyone else on the call who has updates or anything to share with the group as a whole? And if not, we can get into it. So we have a sequence variant interpretation themed call today. And so we have a couple of members from the SVI working group Splicing Subgroup presenting on the call today, who will be sharing this work group's recently, well, it's not published yet, but up as a preprint. I'm sure that the link to that will be in the presentations and we can put it in the chat as well. But the subgroup's recommendations for how RNA and splicing data, both predicted and observed, should be incorporated into the current ACMG framework. So with that, I will hand over to Dr. Logan Walker and Dr. Amanda Spurdle, who have really led this work group and presenting today. Before they get started, a special shout out to them because Logan is in New Zealand and Mandy is in Australia, so it is early in the morning for them, and thank you very much for joining our call. We will hand over to you. Oh, just quickly to note that next meeting will be sort of more of an operational theme meeting, and we'll have Courtney and Matt presenting about some more recent updates to the GCI and gene tracker.
Right. Thank you, Alicia. And welcome everybody. I will just sort out my screen sharing. Okay, that should be good. So yes, as introduced, and thank you for the opportunity to talk about this work, which has happened over a few years, and it's really looking at the ACMG AMP framework in relation to splicing related codes. And on the first slide, so when we look at the ClinGen variant curation expert panel, there's I think at last count, when I counted, there was 53 established VSEPs, and just under a half of these had published their rules that allowed us to look and compare what the different groups were doing and how they were applying the framework to their particular context of disease and gene. And the work that we're looking at in particularly is focusing on splicing data, so assay and computational prediction splicing data. So here's the classic framework that was published in 2015 by Richards et al. And the sorts of codes that we were assessing were the PVS1 code looking at loss of function, variance, the prediction code PP3, and the converse, the PP4 for suggesting no impact on gene splicing, PP3 suggesting impact on gene splicing. We have BP7. If BP4 is observed, then there's potential for a variant to be given at BP7 if there's no splicing shown. And then there's also the functional data where well-established functional assays give PS3, no well-established assays showing no deleterious effect, BS3. And then there was the potential to look at what were really protein-based predictive codes and apply these to a splicing context. So here we have PS1 looking at the amino acid change, and the potential for PM5, although for this particular work, we just put PM5 on the shelf for now. So there's a number of codes that we were looking at, and when we look at, go back to the variant creation expert panels and see how they were applying those codes, this is a heat map, which is quite a crude way of showing how the various codes were being applied by the different variant creation expert panels. So the green here is the code was applied and it was modified by the VSEP from the original ACMG rule. So modified in a gene-specific context, and red is not applied, and the light blue-gray boxes, it's no change from the ACMG rule. So just the curation expert panels that had rules available. I haven't got the names of them there because it would be quite small, but you can see the different categories that the expert panels fall under. But what you can see is quite a lot of heterogeneity with some codes being applied and some not. And this variability can't really be explained solely on the gene-related or disease-specific factors. So even the greens where the modified rules, people have modified it in different aspects. So it is an example, the BP4, which is in one group had at least 3 in silico splicing predictors in agreement, and then gave a list of the splicing factors. Whereas another group, to get PP4 said applied to synonymous or intronic variants where at least 2 out of 3 in silico models predict no splicing impact. So we have one group suggesting 3 splicing predictions in agreement. We had another where 2 out of 3 model in silico prediction models predict no splicing impact. And these different tools are, sorry, my phone just went off and distracted me. The different splicing tools are not all equal in ability. So we have one group sort of listing those tools that can be used, another group not listing any, and allowing the curators to choose their own. So in short, lots of heterogeneity, and there's a lack of guidance on how to apply these splicing related codes. So a few years ago, there was a ClinGen splicing subgroup was established that would look a little closer at recommendations for applying ACMG AMP codes relating to splicing data. And you can see on the left here that the group of individuals who were considered this splicing subgroup, it was chaired by Stephen Harrison and myself and Mandy and Rashid and Tina and Lisa and Amanda And Alicia, who introduced us, was all played an important role in working through the aims of this subgroup. And what were they? That was to define or refine the recommendations for applying ACMG AMP codes relating to splicing assay data and computational predictions. And the aims specifically were to utilize empirically derived splicing evidence to outline a process for applying splicing data to a gene-specific PVS1 decision tree, to determine the evidence weighting of splicing assay and computational data, to calibrate bioinformatic prediction tools, and outline a process for applying a PS1 code for splicing data. So the first code that we looked at was PVS1, and I'm assuming everyone on the call is very familiar with these codes. It's a predictive code for presumed loss of function variance. So ClinGen SVI had previously developed the recommendations for this code, or the application of this code, that had addressed, so the Abu Tayoun paper in 2018 had addressed sort of rescue mechanisms. So rather than very strong evidence, level of evidence for pathogenicity, there are potential sort of mechanisms which would warrant downgrading of that very strong level of code. And they include looking at premature termination codons that occur at the 3' end of the coding sequence, where you'd get a slightly shortened protein, but could still be very functional. You can have variants located in non-constitutive exons, so it's really important to understand the splicing nature of your gene and tissue that it is the disease-related tissue that it's expressed in. And we'll look at this a little bit more closely in a minute. And then there's a in-frame splicing that can occur, which can still maintain a functional protein, and rescue at the 5' end of the gene with the initiation codon, and the potential for new in-frame ATG sites to be used. So what I've done here is not the detailed version that was published in the Abu Tayoun. I've just sort of shown that a summary of how this essentially worked with the splicing. If it's predicted to activate nonsense-mediated decay, then it's been shown to give a very strong level of weighting. If it's not predicted to activate nonsense-mediated decay, then it's important to know the potential effect on protein function, such as looking at critical regions, determining whether or not various regions are lost, and then applying the evidence weights accordingly. What we had done was looked at this a little bit more closely, and there's a lot of work that in particular Miguel de la Hoya had done in the background, sort of refining these in a gene-specific way. So we've done this a lot with cancer susceptibility genes and variant creation expert panels. And we were trying to explain how this could be adapted to across all genes. So if we're going to improve the PVS1 framework, then here's just a made-up gene where we have the ATG initiation site, two different domains, one critical, one role uncertain, and then a stop codon. And then the various exons are in frame. For example, with skipping as exon forward, cause in frame, and so on. So the ACMG AMP code would be different depending on where the splice sites were constituted. So just note again that we're talking about splicing here, even though there is relates to other types of loss of function variants. Here we're looking at the plus minus 1, 2 canonical splice site across the gene. So what we had talked about is the importance to characterize the expression and structure in the reference transcript, what genes, what tissues is it expressed in, and what different isoforms are expressed, and so on, to identify the critical regions of protein function, the importance of building a reference gene-specific splicing catalog, and to identify the potential of naturally occurring rescue transcripts. And just as an example, why are these so important? We can have loss of function variants, but depending on where, or potential loss of function variants, but depending on where they fall within the gene, will change the outcome significantly. So this is just an example where a gene is expressing these different exons. If you have a premature termination codon occurring within the exon 2, or the variant occurring in a constitutively expressed exon 2, you get a stop gain. But what about in the in a exon where it is not always expressed, and it might not be expressed in all tissues, or it could be one of these alternatively spliced exons? Here we have a variant which may or may not cause a functional effect, because it is if it is being missed in a delta exon 3, and this variant, this isoform, still give rise to a functional protein, then there is a potential that this isoform is a rescue isoform. And I haven't done a very good way of explaining that, but I hope you get my drift. So let's come back to this dummy gene, or this example gene, where we have these various splice site codings or evidence weightings, and the changes that we have made with our studied data set. So in the Abu-Tayun PVS1 decision tree, there wasn't really specific address the splicing alterations at the 5' or 3' UTRs. So we've tried to just provide some clarification around variants which occur in the 5' or 3' UTR that cause splicing, but that splicing doesn't actually impact the protein function. Then that doesn't qualify for a PVS1 code. Alternatively, we could have a variant which has, so the PVS1 moderate could be applied if there's at the beginning of the gene where there's no alternative start codons in the transcript set for a gene. This is for a start loss if one or more pathogenic variants have been reported 5' of the next downstream putative in-frame start codon. And so that was quite a conservative application if there is a predicted of no alternative start codons, but we would consider upweighting this based on what we know about the gene and the potential for that there's good possibility that a variant impacting the start site might this might still be, well, sorry, this is really bad. My explanation skills have left me this morning. So here we have a situation where if we're pretty sure that the loss of that initiation start site is not going to be rescued by another start site, and we have good evidence from looking at gene data, other variants that might occur nearby, then we can consider upweighting that from a PVS1 moderate to a PVS1 strong or very strong. Another aspect was looking at the impact of in-frame variants which overlap a critical domain in the Abu-Tayun framework that leads potentially to a strong level of evidence. And what we are suggesting is that consider upweighting even if an in-frame variant is occurring, if it's hitting a critical domain, then there is the potential that that is a very strong event because you're still wiping out some of that critical domain. So something else to be aware of. And then finally, there is the sort of arbitrary nature of how much protein is removed and whether or not you lead to a PVS1 strong or other category. And again, we have suggested that this is upweighted to a very strong if the truncated protein region is still, it misses out a part which is critical to function. So we have detailed that in the manuscript, and we end up getting a number of rules for individual genes, and I just sort of want to highlight some of the detail that, again, I mentioned Miguel de la Hoya, and he has been sort of driving the gene-specific PVS1 adaptation to various genes on some cancer susceptibility specific variant creation expert panels. And here is ACMG gene. And you can see this is focusing on the GTAG splice sites. There is a huge level of detail, and based on our available knowledge of this gene, so we identify the protein domains for this ATM gene, and for each splice site along the gene, there is special rules which are being inserted that would allow curators to know what variant is occurring, what splice sites are variant, and whether it leads to a supporting level of evidence, a strong level of evidence, very strong, and so on. So quite a almost excruciating level of detail, but hopefully very important and allows curators to adapt those rules very quickly. The next thing we wanted to look at is the potential to repurpose PVS1 and BP7 codes to capture splicing data. So this is really looking at the use of this framework for actual splicing assay data generated in a lab. So we know that the application of the PVS1 decision tree for splicing is focused on canonical 1,2 splice site variants. And the variation of those dinucleotides has a high probability to impact splicing. So that's a given, and why we can get up to very strong level of evidence and so on. But if we then confirmed those predictive splicing impacts with mRNA assay data, it doesn't actually add confidence to the starting PVS1 weight. So for example, if we showed that there was a PVS1 supporting for a small in-frame deletion, confirming that actual aberration through a splicing assay doesn't infer greater confidence that the variant is pathogenic. So what then can we use this information still? How do we apply assay data? And what about variants that are outside the canonical dinucleotides? So we can still apply the same logic with the variants outside the canonical dinucleotides. So, and if we find aberrant splicing, we can take it through the same PBS1 decision tree as we would for a canonical dinucleotide. So if we see aberrant splicing, we can go through PBS1 strength, and then we can put this RNA in brackets to highlight that the information has come from assay data. So for example, if using older terminology, if we have an intervening sequence +1, so donor site +1, and where it receives a PBS1 for prediction, we could also get PBS1 through RNA assay. In this case, we'd put PBS1 RNA in brackets to highlight that there's been an RNA result. For outside of the donor dinucleotide, so say it's a +3, this wouldn't qualify for a PBS1 prediction, but it could get a PP3 for prediction, indicating that there's an impact on the splicing. But if we do an RNA assay and we show that there has been a change, there is a potential for that to be upgraded to a PBS1, because the RNA result matches the prediction or the RNA results for this 11+1, which occurs at the donor site. And looking at the benign side of things, variants with no experimentally observed impact on splicing, there's no obvious code, but we can apply a BP7, because in this situation, we've shown empirically that there is no impact on splicing. And for variants that are silent or intronic, could allow for a strong level of evidence in relation to the RNA assay. And you could also apply that in addition to the prediction code. So where we're heading with all this, the recommendation is that what would have been used previously is the PS3, BS3 codes for functional information, that we only apply those for well-established assays that measure functional impact that is not limited to RNA. So protein-based, where it's not only looking at, well, it's not looking at splicing. And we're adapting the PBS1 chart to now use for splicing assays rather than using the PS3, BS3 codes. I hope that made some sense. So we'll just come back to these prediction codes again. So with PP3, multiple lines of computational evidence support deleterious effect on gene product, and BP4, where multiple lines of computational evidence suggest no impact on gene product, and then the potential to apply BP7 for silent variants that have no splicing impact. So from the original chart, you can see that there are this heterogeneity again between the different groups. There are, I think, a potential couple of errors on this chart, which I won't go into. For example, why apply BP4, BP7? So the information here was taken from CSpec. The information was a little bit different in the PDF of the version 1 of the rules for this variant creation expert panel. So I think BP4 should have should be green rather than red. And so the information on the PDF version of the rules wasn't carried through to CSpec. So I have to look at a couple of those just to ensure that there's consistency. But anyway, regardless of that, there is heterogeneity amongst the groups. So we will then wanted to look at these 3 computational codes. We wanted to refine the recommendations for applying the codes in relation to splicing. We also wanted to provide a relatively simple and accessible method for calibrating or recalibrating bioinformatic prediction tools. And this was a comment actually which was asked of a collaborator years ago, who was saying, how do we apply these splicing prediction tools? Where do we set the thresholds? And because tools are constantly changing, how are we able to adapt the rules without getting stuck on each new tool? So the way that we went about doing this was to develop a splicing truth data set, if you'd like, where we know the in vitro splicing assay results, and then generate scores from a computational prediction tool. And so in this diagram just sort of highlights what we're essentially doing is comparing the in vitro splicing assay results with the scores and to determine where to draw these thresholds. And the data set that we used for this manuscript was derived from a number of different sets. We'd been curating for a number of years variants in BRCA1, BRCA2 as part of the Enigma variant creation expert panel. But we also took data from the mismatch repair genes from NF1 and POU1F1, and all the variants that we're talking about are outside the canonical splice sites. So the plus minus 1, 2 splice sites were removed from this data set. So we're not looking at PBS1, we're looking at PP3, BP4, BP7. And then a postdoc in my lab generated a very helpful web tool that allowed us to explore these comparisons of splicing assay and to the prediction of a splicing prediction tool. And in this case, we focused on Splice AI, and obviously the results are all going to be about Splice AI, but it will be the same concept could be applied to any splicing prediction tool. So here we wanted to look at the sensitivity and specificity of the different Splice AI cut points across 3 different categories. So we want a lower threshold, we want an upper threshold, and we want an uninformative category between the upper and lower thresholds. And this is intentional, this category, and this would be where bioinformatic codes should not be applied. So in this tool, it's available, anyone can go and use it. You can change the thresholds, you can change the genes that are on there currently, and determine variant location, whether the splice region, splice site, the dinucleotide splice site, or outside both of those. So how do we do the likelihood ratio calculation? So in this instance here, we've got our truth data set. So we know when we do the Splice AI prediction, we know what the outcome of the splicing is in actuality. Here we've settled on these thresholds with Splice AI. So we'll just look at these thresholds. And so here, all of these variants aren't linked to splicing events. But you can see at above 0.2 threshold, you can see that there is a prediction of a Splice AI, of a splicing event. Here we have a splicing event observed with each variant, and we've got Splice AI scores all along the spectrum. But if we apply these thresholds, then we're only looking at above 0.2. And what we're looking at above 0.2 being predicted splice event and actual splice event, we're looking at the percentage of predicted splicogenic over the percentage of predicted non-splicogenic. So it's the ratio essentially of the probability that the Splice AI score or the Splice AI prediction is correct to the probability that the Splice AI prediction is incorrect. And in this situation, you can see that 4.9% of these the scores are incorrect, and 77.6% of those scores are correct if we go by these thresholds. And I'll tell you why we settled on those thresholds in a minute. But essentially, if we do the calculation, we end up with a likelihood ratio of 15.98. And this is important when we look at the whole table. So we look at the scores of our lower threshold being 0.1, highest threshold being 0.2, and then this uninformative region in the middle where we don't apply any bioinformatic code. We just focus on the likelihood ratios. You can see here we get a range from 0.168 up to 9.989. And this is important because we then want to categorize these. And to do this, we borrow the thresholds that have been used for pathogenicity and benignness. And here, if we use these, we're looking at a supporting level of evidence, moderate level of evidence, strong and very strong, and the odds of pathogenicity. Now, we're not looking at pathogenicity here, we're looking at splicegenicity, the ability of variant cause splicing. And we know that not all splicing leads to pathogenicity. So because of this, we are taking LRs at a moderate level of evidence, and anything that is moderate in either direction. So for the score being less than 0.1, predicting no splicing, we have a score which falls within the moderate category, so between this value and this value. And the score here, which we calculated on the previous slide, again falls in this moderate level of evidence, which is graphically portrayed here, which comes out on the tool that was used to generate these data. So we have quite good distinction between moderate level of evidence towards splicegenicity, an uninformative range, and a moderate level of evidence for non-splicegenicity down here. So we would say that this can be applied to any tool using the same data, although we do hope to increase these data quite significantly. And the data has a variant list where we have the variant, we have the prediction, we know what the outcome is. That there is splicing assay data and alternative prediction scores, as I've mentioned before. We can calculate the likelihood ratio. So this prediction score could be applied to any splicing prediction tool. So one could still, using these same categories, apply whatever score from whatever tool they're using. And the aim is to obtain a moderate level of evidence towards non-splicegenicity and a moderate level of evidence towards splicegenicity. So this could be carried out using a likelihood ratio analysis, and to get the moderate level of or moderate level of evidence. For spliceogenicity, your final LR must be greater than or equal to 4.3, and for the in the benign direction, it has to be less than or equal to 0.23 for spliceogenicity. So why moderate versus supporting? I've already mentioned a little bit about that. It is a conservative recommendation. So we calibrate the codes to reach a moderate level of evidence, as I've mentioned numerous times. But we only apply the prediction codes at a supporting weight. So moderate level of spliceogenicity, but supporting level of evidence for pathogenicity. And as I mentioned before, not all splicogenic variants will be pathogenic. And this is either due to incomplete splicing or aberrant splicing on the protein coding sequence and so on. The tools do not accurately predict those relationships, although the tools are getting better all the time. And there may come a time where there is a good argument that that tools are able to predict a moderate level of evidence, and in fact, some would probably suggest for variants that are very close to the exon that the tool is good enough to get moderate level of evidence, because it predicts both the likelihood of splicing and the impact that splicing is going to have. But at this stage, we're only going at supporting. But yes, there are many reasons why an aberrant splicing event may not be captured by existing tools. So it could be large intron retention, multi-exon skipping, and so on that can't get by prediction, but you would see through an RNA assay. And as I mentioned before, we are hoping to increase the data set and look at these, look at least Splice AI again and other tools that might be used in a diagnostic context. So a summary of what we have is PP3, BP4, and BP7 application, and this we're just focusing on Splice AI, but the same procedure could be used for any tool once thresholds have been identified. So here we have a Splice AI score less than 0.1, less than equal to 0.1, we can apply BP4. If it falls within this non-informative range, we don't apply any code, but there is still the potential to apply a computational prediction code for missense or protein-related impacts. And we have set the upper threshold at greater than 0.2, and in this instance, we would apply PP3 for splicing. So we've got PP4 applied. What about BP7? So if it's synonymous, a silent variant, and intronic variant outside donor except a splice region, if that's yes, we can apply BP7. If it's a no, not to apply BP7. We're just going to dig into this a little bit more. And so the BP7, as I mentioned before, is for synonymous. The original rule had for synonymous silent variant, for which splicing prediction algorithms predict neither an impact to the splice canonical sequence nor creation of a new site, and the nucleotide is not highly conserved. So when we look at the way that BP7 has been applied by the different variant creation expert panels, we see that the definitions are incredibly variable on application, particularly relating to conservation and relevance to intronic variation. So this original definition never specifically talks about intronic, and different groups have either highlighted that intronic variants are to be included, or it remains so depending on your definition of synonymous, whether that includes intronic non-coding variants, or whether it must be an exonic non-coding variant. A change which does not cause a variant change, which doesn't cause a change in the coding sequence. So, and yes, this BP7 reflects a low prior after consideration of the splicing prediction. And what we are recommending is that it should not be applied to synonymous substitutions in some locations. And these locations are near the splice site variants where there's a higher prior probability of causing a splicing change. So particularly at the first base or the last 3 bases of the exon. And in fact, we've gone more conservative with that in our rules and have suggested that it's the splicing region extends in the acceptor region to -20 and in the donor region to +6. So we would apply it outside those regions. But that's something that the different expert panels will decide for themselves. The BP7 code may be applied for intronic variants. I think it's important to be specific about this, and this assumes that there is a mechanism. Possible effects will be mRNA mRNA processing. So the only established mechanisms for intronic this point are on RNA splicing, but there may be other mechanisms that people are aware of that I'm not, and that might be discovered in coming years where intronic variants need to be assessed for more than just splicing. And what about evolutionary conservation for application of the BP7 code? And we're suggesting caution about the inclusion of this rule. You can see that it is originally suggested in the Richards et al. In the 2015 paper. And here we're suggesting that people be very aware of why they're applying it, and that they need empirically derived justification. So the choice of tool for predicting conservation, evolutionary depth, the cut point to define a nucleotide as not highly conserved, where do you draw that threshold? So we did a little bit of work to hopefully justify why we're taking that stance. So here we looked at a data set of around 28,000 variants that are within or adjacent to just over 2,000 exons. And what we found in this data set is when we look at intronic variants outside the donor and acceptor splice regions, so this is outside these our conservative regions that would have already been tested. A Splice AI prediction said to apply BP4. If we add in the conservation aspect of this rule, what we end up having is 712 variants. 685 of them would not be considered highly conserved, and this is using the vertebrate phylo P category of less than 2 for not highly conserved and greater than or equal to 2 for conserved. So if we use these thresholds using this tool, we would end up with 27 of these variants from the 712 set to be marked as conserved. These guys would go into observed splicing or no splicing. So the data set that we had splicing information available from all those variants. So we know that there is splicing for 2 of those, and no observed splicing for 683. But it's this side which is most important. So here we have 27 being shown to be conserved, but actually none of them have observed splicing. So, and there's no observed splicing for all 27. So if we were applying the conserved rule, we would actually be removing 27 variants where there is no observed splicing, and that being the mechanism for potential pathogenicity. So 27 variants would miss out on the BP7 score for no reason. So we would suggest that for silent and intronic variants where BP4 is applied, and of course we're using this threshold, this lower threshold that we talked about in the previous slides, that we would have fewer variants receiving the BP7 code, and we would have no improvement in negative prediction. So the lack of conservation has limited prediction power to detect non-splice disruption variants. And when we look to this is for intronic variants, but when we did the same for silent and synonymous variants and silent synonymous exonic variants, we essentially showed the same thing, that the observed splicing was 0. So why might this be the case? Because conceptually, oh, no, I'm going to give up on that word. Why conservation is not useful. There is, we've already used splicing prediction tools, and many of them would capture conservation in the context of the predicted variant impact via abrogation of the function of splicing motifs. And then for some of them, the position weight matrices also allow for some nucleotide variation within the splicing motif. So caution about using conservation as a tool to predict BP7 or to warrant BP7 application. What about PS1? So here we have originally PS1 is the same amino acid change as an established pathogenic variant. Can we use this for splicing and using the same logic that if we have the same predicted splicing impact as a previously classified likely or pathogenic variant, we could potentially apply PS1. Again, we have to indicate that it's a splicing. Coming from a splicing perspective, already there have been 5 different expert panels applying PS1 in a splicing context, but they've all got different specifications. So here's a summary of how we would go about doing this. So here we would, we're looking at the similarity of predicted RNA effects for a variant under assessment and in comparison to a known pathogenic variant. And I'm not going to go through the whole table, but I'll just highlight a couple of rows. So variant under assessment, where is it located? What type of rule could have been given to that variant under assessment? The comparison variant, so this is the variant that's already known to be likely or pathogenic variant. And so it's already been classified. So here we're trying to capture some of that existing evidence of pathogenicity. And the PS1 code applicable to the variant under assessment depends on whether it's a pathogenic comparison variant or a likely pathogenic comparison variant. So if we look at the top row, here we have a variant which is falling outside the canonical dinucleotide. So it can't get a PVS1, but it could get a PP3 if there's a prediction of spliceogenicity. If we look at a comparison variant, so say there's a variant, another variant which has occurred at the same nucleotide and it's been deemed to be pathogenic, then we can borrow the evidence that's been used to get a PS1, a strong level of evidence, and for this original this original variant which falls outside the dinucleotide. So a strong level of evidence, borrowing evidence which has come from this comparison variant. And of course, if the comparison variant is only likely pathogenic, then we downgrade accordingly because there's slightly less evidence. What about a variant within the dinucleotide? So here we have a canonical dinucleotide variant, which was assessed using the PVS1 decision tree and given a PVS1 score. Within the same dinucleotide, canonical dinucleotide, there is another variant which has received a classification, and in this case, the classification has been pathogenic. So here we give a PS1 supporting, rather than a PS1 strong level of evidence, we give a PS1 supporting, and the reason being is if you end up giving a strong level of evidence to this variant under assessment, you could end up with a final score which is greater than that of the comparison variant, and that doesn't make sense. So we only apply a low level supporting evidence to this canonical, so we don't overweight that variant under assessment. And we don't apply, in this case, we don't apply the likely pathogenic comparison variant because a PVS1 to get, there's a potential for a variant to get to that point, a splice site variant to get to likely pathogenic without any clinical information. Okay, that's all I'll say about that. So we're on the home straight now. So to summarize all the information, I know you can't read this decision tree, but it's just to highlight that that's been developed and included in the manuscript. So this is for the application of the bioinformatic codes and the RNA splicing assay results for variant interpretation. So we start with our variant under assessment. We either go for splicing prediction data only and all the different categories, the prediction, whether it's PP3, PS1, BP4, et cetera. But we also might have splicing assay data, and then we go through a tree, a decision tree, looking at how we might assess that splicing data, which incorporates the PVS1 decision tree and the BP7 decision. So that's available for review for those who want to go and have a look. Within the paper, we also look at other considerations. There's so many things that we could have looked at when we're going through the application of splicing codes and where the data has come from and how trustworthy is the data, et cetera, et cetera. So we have included a table sort of listing aspects which haven't been detailed within the main text of the paper. And this includes previously published rubrics for interpretation of RNA assay data. So CAMVIG UK published a few years ago how to deal with RNA assay data. Splice Accord, which is led by Professor Sandra Cooper in Australia, it provided recommendations on interpreted and European best match repair working group, and there may be others which weren't obvious searching. So we'd be very keen to know if people were aware of other rubrics that go into that level of detail. We also provide a summary table that goes through each of the codes, looks at the original definition from the Richards et al. 2015. I've formatted it funny on the slide, but it's just to fit it in so it doesn't look quite as odd as this in the paper, I promise. The original definition and then the redefinition that we have talked about this morning. And then we provide some notes in relation to each of the rules. So, for summary, PS3 was well defined in the Richards et al. Paper, but we're now suggesting don't apply for splicing effects. Instead, we look at this PVS1 strength decision tree with the RNA sort of code alongside it. And you'll see in the notes that there's a lot of C figure 4 flowchart, C figure 4 flowchart, and so on. So we're essentially saying, providing some overview of why the redefinition, but to apply it to go to that flowchart. And that's me done. So at the moment, the paper's under review for publication, but you can see a copy of it on medRxiv, and I've just screenshotted the top of the page so you can see the individuals who were involved with writing and reviewing the manuscript, and of course doing all the hard work behind the scenes. So I'll stop there and thank you. I'm happy to take any questions.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Logan. So we are at the hour. If people need to drop off, definitely feel free to. But Logan, it seems like you're happy to stay on for a bit to answer some questions if people do perhaps have one or two burning questions. But to wrap up for people that are going, huge thank you, Logan, for presenting what really has been a number of years of work from lots of people, and will be a fantastic resource. And then the link to that paper, the preprint, is in the chat as well, and I'm sure Logan is happy to take questions by email as well as for people who want to stay on now to ask anything.
This is just Mandy saying that well done, Logan. That was a lot to capture in an hour. It's really a huge amount of work. I've had a few questions from Dimitri sent personally to me, which was more about whether Splice AI seems to make more mistakes with increase of distance from intron-exon junctions. Should distance from the intron-exon junction be taken into account? And my response to him is we tried to look at that, but didn't have enough data. And that's a real problem with historical data sets, because people basically don't do deep intronic sequencing to find the variants. And even now, quite often, they only go and find the variants once they've altered splicing. So they don't actually have the negative prediction results. And that's true of another data set that we are hoping to get access to through Invitae by discussion, Logan and I. And then there was a question here from R. Sazi. Any suggestion on inefficient or leaky splicing? We haven't really looked at that yet. That's going to be the next phase. But there's huge issues with whether people actually present their data in a way that you can look at percentage aberration at all, whether they present the data in that way. And then the other thing is, whether they account for NMD inhibition and all sorts of other things. And so we know that from a lot of the larger data sets and the way that people do things, that if you don't account for NMD, you actually have to do comparisons against the junction of your gene against controls. And you use that ratio to show if there's been a change in the junction, but doesn't actually give you real percentage, which is what we would need to address that question. I think that's maybe all that we need to say here. And
also, sorry.
Yeah.
So there is a question from Emily in the chat. Emily, I'm not sure if you want to ask it yourself, or otherwise I can read out for people that aren't able to read it.
I'd be happy to ask it myself too, but so first off, yes, just to echo everyone else, fantastic presentation, and I eagerly read the preprint as soon as I saw it up. So I was wondering, how you would recommend doing, weighting experimental evidence, for our altered RNA splicing, using different methods, specifically thinking about RNA-seq versus mini-gene assays, and whether you might consider downgrading those done, in kind of more targeted, or, depending on the assay validity. Of note of that wasn't really, from my understanding, seemed to be talked that much about in the paper by Brunick et al. So I'd love to hear any thoughts you guys have had on it.
Yeah, so when you say RNA-seq, you're meaning RNA-seq of patient material versus many genes.
Yes.
Yeah, look, this is really tricky, and I guess different groups have come up with their own sort of rubrics to cope with those sorts of questions. We know that there are some quite large, high throughput mini gene assay data coming online, and they where do I go with this? So there are probably a couple of things. One, when we've looked at mini gene assay data for our cancer susceptibility genes, we see quite a high level of consistency with what we might expect from patient material. So, we would, I think our rules would downgrade the weight from mini gene, but, not much. But we've seen when there's been surveys of individuals looking at examples of mini gene assays, and these people are from research or diagnostic labs, there's a huge range of variability there, where people, some think mini genes are the bee's knees, and the data that was obtained is trustworthy. Others don't trust it at all, and would, no matter what it showed, maybe a supporting level of evidence most, and maybe that's come from experience with different genes which are being assessed by those individuals. So personally, I mean, we have addressed this to some extent within the paper, but we've been probably, I was going to say hand wavy. It's probably not very good terminology, but we've suggested, that the VCEPs go back and assess in their own context whether it's what assays are being used, what tissues being used, and so on.
Yeah, I saw that, I did see in the guidelines that, if there was not a kind of, downgrade by one level, or, so I guess.
Yeah.
This is Mandy. I think we've had this discussion within the Enigma Consortium. I can't tell you how many times. And probably one of the conservative options is you need to know not just your gene, you need to know your exon, and you calibrate it for the exon. Well, great. By the time you've done that, you've probably done an assay on absolutely everything. But at least in our experience, when we did a calibration, a formal calibration, using the LR calculations that Logan talked about, for consensus site variants, they performed as well as the patient data. There was no difference in the result, but more likely for the other ones where you might see a difference. But that could be just because, again, you don't predict as well your outcome for a +3 or 5 variant. It's just not, as well. So, I would expect that could be the case. However, I think if you've designed your thing well enough, and you're picking up, the multi-exon skipping all those other things around, and that the cell lines you're doing in will reflect more what you expect to be for your disease, you could actually trust it. But conservatively, downgrade by one would be the thing. I can't remember whether I don't think we even had that in our decision tree here. I can't remember.
No, yeah. So that's why it was, because it's a pressure that comes up.
I'm sure it does. Yeah. But
Yeah.
Logan's quite right. And then the variability just in people's confidence in how they will use them is like, I'm quite confident. I think if you put those other caveats in, then yeah, you can use it. Why wouldn't you? But you need to have a few examples where you've got both patient RNA and it doesn't necessarily even need to be RNA-seq. It could be good old-fashioned RT-PCR as well. You know, if you've got examples where the patient RNA is giving you the same result as the construct, you should be able to at least give yourself more confidence that that system is working well for your gene or that exon for your gene. And that would be my recommendation for anyone who's wanting to set up to use constructs more routinely.
I mean, I agree with you, Mandy. It's just the general concept of, is this assay working well for your gene? You know, for you know, the genes like with the Enigma genes and these really well studied ones, there's so much data, there's no reason to not. But if it's never, you know, it's a novel genes, fairly undefined, and depending on the assay type, you would want to probably be more conservative.
And again, I suppose if you've got known pathogenic variants, you don't have to necessarily even know what the patient material result is, as long as you've got something to calibrate it against.
Yeah.
But for rare diseases, you're stuffed right away because they're rare. So you're going to have very few examples either way. Benign sometimes is as much as a problem as pathogenic.
Thank you. That was, you know, I think it's incredibly helpful. And of course, you know, the cancer field is leading the way. I don't know if, you know, as we go on, hopefully kind of getting just a broader range too, to see if there's, as you know, good performance, et cetera. But it's quite interesting.
Yeah, it's going to be a debate for years to come, I think.
Still lots of work to do.
Lots of work to do, but all the more interesting, therefore, right? And thank you about that work.
Okay, if there's not any other questions, we'll end there. Thank you so much to Logan and Mandy for staying on a bit later and answering those questions, and for everyone else who stayed on to listen to the answers. Obviously a topic that people are very interested in, and yeah, thank you so much for all the work that's gone into this.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And a lot of people doing a lot of things.